My 8-year-old daughter came home from her aunt's house smiling, clutching a plastic grocery bag, and wearing a bright pink bucket hat. Auntie Jasmine said my hair was not fair to Riley, and made me wear this all day, she whispered innocently, as she pulled the hat off. What was hiding underneath made my blood run freezing cold. Her beautiful waist-length honey blonde hair had been hacked down to the scalp, leaving jagged patches and a streak of dried blood crusted above her ear. I did not scream. I did not cry. I just grabbed my car keys. My name is Monica. I am 33 years old, and I work as a senior financial auditor. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up and protect your child from the very people who share your blood. It was a crisp Saturday afternoon in our quiet Chicago suburb when my husband Daniel dropped Lily off after picking her up from my brother's house. Daniel is 35, a calm and supportive man, and he had simply honked the horn and waved from the driveway, rushing off to run an errand, completely unaware of the nightmare sitting in the back seat. Lily walked through the front door humming a cheerful tune. She looked so small, so trusting. When she took off that awful pink bucket hat, time completely stopped. I fell to my knees right there in the entryway. My hands hovered over her head, trembling, as my eyes registered the sheer violence of what had been done to my baby. The long golden hair I had carefully brushed and braided every single morning since she was a toddler was entirely gone. In its place were aggressive, uneven patches of stubble. It looked as though someone had taken kitchen shears and violently sawed through her hair in blind rage. But the physical destruction of her hair was not the worst part. As I gently turned her face toward the light, I saw it. A deep, ugly gash right above her left ear. The blood had already dried into a dark crust, matting the few remaining strands of hair to her skin. My heart pounded against my ribs like a trapped animal. This was not a childhood accident. This was not kids playing salon in a bathroom. A slip of the scissors like that required intense downward force. It meant whoever did this had to physically pin my 8-year-old child down against her will. Then Lily proudly held out the crumpled plastic grocery bag she had been carrying. "Auntie Jasmine told me to give this to you," she said, her sweet voice totally devoid of understanding. I opened the plastic handles. Inside, coiled like a dead snake, was Lily's entire braided ponytail. It had been sheared off in one thick, brutal cut. The smell of cheap salon chemicals hit my nose. Most mothers would have broken down into hysterical sobs. Most mothers would have grabbed their phone, dialed their husband in a panic, or immediately called the police to report an assault. But I am not most mothers. My brain operates differently. As a senior financial auditor, my entire career is built on removing emotion from chaotic situations, identifying anomalies, and dismantling fraudulent systems piece by piece. In that moment, standing in my pristine hallway with my daughters, severed hair in my hands, my professional instincts completely took over. I was no longer just a mother. I was an investigator analyzing a fresh crime scene. I looked into Lily's innocent blue eyes. "Did it hurt when she cut it, sweetie?" I asked, forcing my voice to remain perfectly level and calm so I would not frighten her. Lily touched the dried blood on her ear and winced slightly. "A little bit. Auntie Jasmine said I was moving too much. She held my head down real hard because she said it was time for Riley to be the pretty one for a change. Riley is my niece, my brother David's daughter, who is exactly Lily's age." The puzzle pieces snapped into place with terrifying clarity. Jasmine had orchestrated this entire cousin spa day just to get her hands on my daughter. I did not panic. I calmly walked Lily into the bathroom, grabbed a warm washcloth, and gently cleaned the dried blood from her ear, meticulously noting the depth and angle of the laceration. I promised her everything was fine, set her up in the living room with her favorite cartoon, and gave her a bowl of strawberries. I made sure she felt completely safe and loved. I looked at my phone sitting on the kitchen counter. Daniel's name was right there at the top of my recent contacts. One press of a button and he would rush home. But I knew if Daniel saw what had been done to his little girl, his protective instincts would ignite. He would lose his temper, rush over there, and cause a screaming match that Jasmine would inevitably twist to play the victim just like she always did. I could not afford emotional outbursts. I needed absolute surgical precision to handle this correctly. I picked up the plastic bag containing the severed braid. I placed it carefully on the passenger seat of my car. I grabbed my keys, my pulse beating a slow, steady rhythm in my ears. I backed out of the driveway, the tires crunching softly against the pavement, and steered my car toward the affluent neighborhood where my brother and his wife lived, in a massive custom-built house fully paid for by my parents. I was not going to yell. I was not going to give them the satisfaction of my tears. I was going to deliver a message they would never forget, and I was going to do it on my exact terms. The games ended. The drive to my brother's house took exactly 14 minutes. I used that time to compartmentalize my fury, locking it away behind a wall of pure analytical focus. I pulled into the sprawling circular driveway of the house David and Jasmine shared. It was a massive brick estate with perfectly manicured hedges, tall pillars, and a 3-car garage. Looking at that house always left a bitter taste in my mouth. David, who was 36 and worked a mediocre mid-level job, could never have afforded a property in this zip code. My parents, Thomas and Barbara, had purchased this $2 million mansion for him outright as a wedding gift. They drained a massive portion of their investments to ensure their golden boy had a home suitable for raising his family. Meanwhile, when Daniel and I were struggling to pay off my student loans and save for our modest starter home, my parents offered us nothing but lectures on financial responsibility. I stepped out of the car clutching the plastic grocery bag containing Lily's hair. The crisp autumn wind whipped around me as I walked up the custom stone pathway to the grand double doors. I pressed the illuminated doorbell once. I did not pound my fists against the wood. I did not yell. I simply waited. The heavy oak door swung open, and there stood Jasmine. She was 35, wearing a silk designer lounge set and holding a crystal glass of sparkling water. Her own hair was styled in flawless, expensive extensions that draped perfectly over her shoulders. When she saw me standing on her porch, her lips curved into a slow, arrogant smirk. She did not look surprised to see me. In fact, she looked like she had been waiting for this exact moment, anticipating my arrival, so she could enjoy the fallout of her cruelty. "Oh, Monica," she drawled, leaning casually against the doorframe, taking a slow sip from her glass. "I figured you would be rushing over here. Let me guess, Lily went crying to you about her little haircut." I stared at her. I noted the complete lack of remorse in her posture. I noted the glint of malice in her eyes. I held up the plastic bag. "You restrained my 8-year-old daughter and hacked her hair off to the scalp. You cut her ear." Jasmine rolled her eyes, waving her manicured hand dismissively, as if I were complaining about a spilled glass of milk. "Do not be so dramatic, Monica. It was just kids playing salon. Riley wanted to be a hairdresser today, and Lily volunteered to be the client. Besides, it is just hair. It will grow back." You held her down. I stated, my voice eerily calm, refusing to take her bait. "She told me you held her head down while she cried." Jasmine scoffed, her smirk widening into a full display of narcissistic entitlement. She crossed her arms, defensive and aggressive all at once. "Listen to yourself. You are making a mountain out of a molehill because your precious, perfect little girl finally had to share the spotlight. You and your husband pamper that kid too much. She parades around with that long hair acting like she is a princess, and it makes Riley feel bad about herself. Lily needed to learn some empathy for Riley's differences. I did her a favor. I taught her a lesson about fairness and sharing the stage. You should be thanking me for helping your daughter build character instead of standing on my porch throwing a tantrum." The sheer audacity of her gaslighting was breathtaking. She was actually trying to frame the physical assault and mutilation of a child as a progressive lesson in empathy. She was using her own daughter Riley as a shield to justify her deeply rooted jealousy and toxic behavior. She expected me to start screaming. She wanted me to call her names so she could immediately play the victim, run to my parents, and claim I was attacking her unprovoked. I did not give her what she wanted. I did not waste a single breath arguing with a woman who derived pleasure from traumatizing a child. I did not debate the definition of empathy or fairness. Instead, I shifted my weight, planted my feet firmly on the stone porch, and brought my right hand across her face with every ounce of strength I possessed. The sound of the slap was like a gunshot in the quiet suburban neighborhood. It was a sharp, explosive crack that echoed off the brick walls of the mansion. The sheer force of the impact snapped Jasmine's head to the side. Her crystal glass flew out of her hand, shattering into dozens of pieces against the floorboards of the entryway. Jasmine lost her footing, completely tumbling backward and crashing hard onto the hardwood floor of her extravagant foyer. She gasped, clutching her rapidly reddening cheek, her eyes wide with absolute shock. For the first time since I had known her, the smug, arrogant mask completely slipped away, leaving only raw, stunned disbelief. She opened her mouth to speak, but only a strangled wheezing sound came out. David suddenly appeared at the top of the grand staircase, drawn by the sound of shattering glass. "What is going on down there?" he yelled, his footsteps pounding heavily as he scrambled down the stairs. "Jasmine, what happened?" I did not wait for his arrival. I bent down and calmly retrieved the plastic grocery bag containing Lily's hair, which I had dropped on the welcome mat during the strike. I looked down at Jasmine sprawled on the floor among the broken crystal and spilled water. Her chest heaved as she stared up at me in terror. I did not utter a single threat. I did not offer any explanation or warning to the golden boy rushing to his wife's aid. The stinging red handprint rapidly swelling across Jasmine's cheek was the only message they needed to receive today. I turned my back on them, stepped over the shattered glass, and walked down the stone pathway with the exact same measured, steady pace I had used to approach the house. By the time David reached the front door shouting my name into the cold air, I was already starting my car. I put the vehicle in drive and pulled away from the curb, watching my brother frantically checking his wife in the rearview mirror. My breathing was steady. My mind was razor sharp. The physical altercation was over, but the real destruction, the systematic financial and legal dismantling of the toxic empire my family had built, was just about to begin. The steering wheel felt solid under my grip as I navigated out of the gated community. The manicured lawns and towering oak trees faded in the rearview mirror, giving way to the busy interstate. I drove in complete silence. My mind did not dwell on the stinging sensation in my palm or the shattered crystal on Jasmine's floor. Instead, it traveled back through the decades of blatant inequality that had paved the road to this exact moment. David had always been the golden child, the flawless firstborn son who could literally do no wrong in the eyes of my parents. Growing up, his mediocrity was celebrated as unbridled genius. When he brought home average grades, my parents praised his effort and blamed the teachers. When he quit sports teams because the practices were too demanding, they commended his ability to set boundaries. He floated through life on a thick cushion of unearned praise and endless financial bailouts. He never held a steady job for more than a year before his mid-30s, always relying on my parents to smooth over his failures and fund his next grand illusion of success. My reality was a stark, unforgiving contrast. I was the daughter expected to figure it out entirely on my own. When I was accepted into a highly competitive accounting program, Thomas and Barbara flatly refused to help with tuition, claiming the struggle would build my character. I took out crippling student loans that shadowed my finances for a decade. I worked double shifts at a local diner while studying for my grueling certification exams, running on cheap caffeine and sheer grit to earn my position as a senior financial auditor. When Daniel and I got married, we scraped together every single penny. We skipped vacations, drove used cars, and lived on a strict budget for 5 years, just to afford the down payment on our modest 3-bedroom house. Yet when David announced he was marrying Jasmine, my parents magically found a bottomless well of immense generosity. They did not just help with a modest down payment or contribute to the closing costs. They completely drained a massive portion of their lifelong savings and liquidated crucial retirement accounts to purchase that $2 million mansion outright. They handed the deed to David and Jasmine as a lavish wedding gift, ensuring their golden boy would never have to experience the indignity of a monthly mortgage payment. When I questioned the financial logic of destroying their own security for David's luxury, my mother angrily called me a jealous, bitter sister who could not stand to see her brother thrive. But the extreme financial favoritism was only a symptom of a much deeper psychological sickness. Thomas and Barbara were utterly obsessed with appearances. They lived and breathed for the fleeting validation of their affluent social circle. To the outside world, they desperately needed to project the image of a perfect, wealthy, and highly progressive family. Actual familial love was entirely secondary to optics. They treated their children not as human beings with actual emotional needs, but as convenient props to enhance their own social standing in the community. When David brought Jasmine home, my parents found the ultimate prop for their social theater. Jasmine, being an African-American woman, allowed Thomas and Barbara to loudly broadcast their progressive values to their elite, predominantly white country club friends. They weaponized her race as a shiny badge of honor for their own modern enlightenment. To maintain this flawless, progressive facade, they bent over backward to accommodate Jasmine's every ridiculous demand and overlook her glaring character flaws. They allowed her to dictate family holidays, control the narrative at every social gathering, and trample over anyone who dared to disagree with her toxic behavior. I was the designated sacrificial lamb in their ongoing theater of perfection. My independence, my analytical logic, and my steadfast refusal to participate in their fake, harmonious displays made me a constant threat to their carefully curated image. Whenever Jasmine threw a narcissistic tantrum or David made a catastrophic financial blunder, my parents instinctively deflected the blame onto me to protect the golden couple. They constantly sacrificed my emotional well-being to inflate David's fragile ego and feed Jasmine's insatiable demand for absolute compliance. They expected me to absorb the abuse, smile for the holiday photographs, and play the role of the quiet, supportive sister. If I ever pushed back against Jasmine's blatant disrespect, Thomas and Barbara would immediately accuse me of harboring deep-seated prejudices. They used my hard-earned stability as a weapon against me, claiming that because I was strong and capable, I should naturally absorb the burdens of those who were supposedly more vulnerable. They demanded endless grace for Jasmine and David, while offering me nothing but harsh judgment and impossible standards. For 33 years, I had swallowed the injustice. I had kept my mouth shut at tense family dinners, ignoring the passive-aggressive comments about my practical career and my unassuming lifestyle. I had allowed them to live in their delusion because cutting them off entirely felt like a failure on my part as a daughter and a sister. But sitting in my car with the plastic bag containing my daughter's hair resting on the passenger seat, the last shred of familial obligation completely evaporated. They had crossed the sacred line from toxic adults playing petty status games to active abusers harming an innocent 8-year-old child. I pulled into my own driveway, the engine purring softly as I shifted the car into park. My modest home looked sturdy and safe against the afternoon sky. Daniel was inside, likely preparing a late lunch for Lily, completely unaware of the absolute war that had just been declared. My parents' obsession with their perfect image had finally collided with my absolute refusal to let my daughter become their next convenient victim. I gripped the steering wheel, feeling the cool leather under my palms. I was no longer the overlooked daughter seeking their validation. I was an auditor, and I was about to rip open the books on their entire lives. Understanding Jasmine's particular brand of toxicity requires understanding exactly how she weaponized her identity to manipulate my parents. Jasmine is an African-American woman, and she quickly realized that Thomas and Barbara possessed a paralyzing fear of appearing socially regressive. My parents ran in elite, predominantly white suburban circles, where projecting an image of flawless modern inclusivity was their highest priority. Jasmine figured out exactly how to exploit that white guilt within weeks of dating my brother. She mastered the art of taking any legitimate criticism, any boundary, or any personal disagreement and instantly reframing it as a targeted racial attack. If David gently suggested they stick to a budget, she would tearfully accuse him of trying to financially oppress a woman of color. If Barbara asked her to help clean up after a Thanksgiving dinner, Jasmine would loudly announce that she was not brought into this family to be their domestic servant. It was a brilliant, terrifyingly effective strategy. She built an impenetrable shield of victimhood around herself. Any attempt to hold Jasmine accountable for her reckless spending, her cruel remarks, or her chronic narcissism was immediately met with aggressive accusations of prejudice. Thomas and Barbara swallowed it whole. They were absolutely terrified that Jasmine would take to social media and expose them as an intolerant family. To prevent that imaginary scandal, they bent the knee every single time, granting her absolute immunity from the rules of basic human decency. The defining clash between Jasmine and me, the moment our mutual hostility was permanently cemented, happened 2 years ago during what my family now refers to as the salon incident. Jasmine had suddenly decided she wanted to be an entrepreneur. She wanted to open a high-end luxury hair salon in one of the most expensive commercial districts in downtown Chicago. She invited Daniel and me over for dinner and ambushed me with a thick folder of disorganized paperwork. David had already exhausted his financial credibility, and Jasmine needed a co-signer for a massive commercial lease and a six-figure small business loan. She slid the folder across the dining table, expecting my pristine credit score and my formidable salary as a senior financial auditor to blindly underwrite her vanity project. I opened the folder. It took me exactly 4 minutes to realize the entire venture was financial suicide. Jasmine had no business plan. She had no market analysis and no realistic revenue projections. What she did have was a glossy mood board filled with imported Italian leather styling chairs, crystal chandeliers, and a list of absurdly expensive organic hair products she planned to stock. The overhead costs alone would bankrupt her within 3 months. The projected profit margins were based on pure fantasy. I closed the folder, slid it back across the table, and gave her a flat, professional refusal. I told her the numbers did not make sense. I explained that co-signing a loan of that magnitude for an unproven business with zero structural planning was a liability I would not take on. I kept my tone neutral and completely focused on the mathematics. Jasmine did not argue the numbers. She did not defend her business model. Instead, she immediately deployed her ultimate weapon. She pushed her chair back, knocking it to the floor, and burst into theatrical tears. She began screaming that I was deliberately trying to destroy a minority-owned business. She yelled that I was jealous of her vision and that I simply could not stand the thought of a Black woman achieving independence and success in my family. She weaponized her identity so swiftly and so violently that it sucked all the oxygen out of the room. Thomas and Barbara went into an immediate blind panic. My mother literally covered my mouth with her hand to stop me from defending myself. My father dragged me into the kitchen, his face purple with rage. They cornered me near the refrigerator, viciously reprimanding me for my lack of support. Thomas told me I was a cold, calculating machine who cared more about spreadsheets than family loyalty. Barbara hyperventilated, pacing the kitchen floor and crying about what Jasmine might tell her friends about our family. They accused me of being a liability to their reputation. They demanded that I march back into the dining room and apologize to Jasmine immediately. They insisted I needed to beg for her forgiveness to maintain family peace. I was exhausted, I was outnumbered, and I just wanted to get Daniel and go home. So I walked back into the dining room and delivered a cold, tactical apology to de-escalate the situation. I apologized for hurting her feelings, but I stood my ground on the finances. I refused to sign the loan. To bypass my refusal, Thomas and Barbara secretly pulled strings, leveraged their own real estate company, and quietly secured the funding for Jasmine's salon themselves. They poured hundreds of thousands of dollars into her fantasy just to keep her happy and maintain their image as supportive progressive in-laws. I knew back then that the salon was a ticking time bomb. I knew her utter lack of business acumen, combined with her massive ego, would eventually lead to total financial ruin. I just did not realize how catastrophic that ruin would become, or that it would directly lead to my 8-year-old daughter being pinned down in a chair and assaulted. Jasmine was drowning in debt. Her luxury salon was bleeding money, and her desperation had reached a boiling point. She needed cash quickly to keep up her glamorous facade, and she was willing to stoop to the most sickening depths to get it, even if it meant harvesting and monetizing the physical attributes of her own niece. I reached for the door handle of my car, the cold metal grounding my racing thoughts. The past was prologue, but the present was a battlefield of my own making. I walked up my driveway fully prepared to rip the mask off my entire family. I walked up my driveway fully prepared to rip the mask off my entire family. The cool autumn air hit my face, but my blood was boiling with a protective rage that sharpened my focus. To understand the sheer depravity of what had just occurred, you have to understand the dynamic between Lily and her cousin Riley. The two girls were born exactly 3 weeks apart. In a healthy family, they would have been best friends. But Jasmine never allowed that. Jasmine treated Riley like a competitive show pony. She dressed her daughter in stiff designer clothes, pushed her into aggressive child modeling casting calls, and constantly monitored every single thing the child ate or said. Riley was a sweet little girl, but she always carried a heavy look of exhaustion in her eyes. She lived under the crushing weight of her mother's relentless demand for visual perfection. Lily, on the other hand, was just a child. She loved digging for bugs in the garden, climbing the oak tree in our backyard, and running around in paint-stained overalls. Her long, honey blonde hair was naturally thick and radiant, usually tied back in a messy braid to keep it out of her face while she played. She possessed an effortless, joyful confidence that drew people to her naturally. At family gatherings, relatives would gravitate toward Lily's bright laughter and easygoing nature. They would casually praise her beautiful hair or her bright blue eyes without a second thought. Every single compliment directed at my daughter was a dagger in Jasmine's fragile ego. Jasmine could not stand that her meticulously curated daughter was being outshone by a child who spent her weekends building mud forts. She deeply resented Lily's natural confidence. Jasmine viewed my daughter's effortless happiness as a direct insult to her own strict parenting methods and a personal attack on Riley's spotlight. Jasmine spent hours every morning flat ironing and styling Riley's hair, trying to achieve a specific look for social media validation. Seeing Lily receive natural affection without any effort drove Jasmine into a silent, bitter fury. She weaponized that envy, projecting her own deep-seated insecurities onto an 8-year-old child. I unlocked my front door and stepped inside the house. The familiar scent of vanilla and clean laundry wrapped around me, providing a stark contrast to the violence I had just encountered. I could hear Daniel in the kitchen gently talking to Lily while preparing her lunch. As I listened to my daughter's small, hesitant voice, the true sinister nature of the morning washed over me. The haircut was not a simple act of spontaneous anger. It was not a harmless prank gone wrong. It was a highly calculated psychological strike. Jasmine had specifically requested this cousin's spa day under the guise of family bonding. She had isolated my daughter in a bathroom away from the other adults. She had physically pinned a terrified 8-year-old child to a chair, holding her head down with such aggressive downward force that the heavy kitchen shears sliced directly into the tender flesh of her ear. And she did it all while forcing her own daughter Riley to stand there and watch. Jasmine wanted to break Lily's spirit. She wanted to humiliate her and strip away the very thing that brought her natural compliments. The psychological torture did not end with the scissors. Jasmine then forced Lily to wear a bright pink bucket hat for the remainder of the day. She framed it as a punishment, telling my sweet girl that her natural hair was somehow unfair to Riley. She made Lily sit there for hours, hiding her mutilated scalp, feeling ugly and ashamed, while Jasmine undoubtedly gloated over her handiwork. It was a power play designed to establish dominance and inflict maximum emotional damage on a helpless child. Jasmine was a 35-year-old woman using my daughter as a psychological punching bag to soothe her own pathetic feelings of inadequacy. The physical laceration on Lily's ear would heal in a few weeks. The hair would eventually grow back into a stylish bob. But the emotional scar of being held down and violently violated by an adult family member was a trauma that could last a lifetime. Jasmine had intentionally introduced my daughter to the concept of pure, unadulterated malice. She had betrayed the fundamental trust a child places in a protective adult. I walked into the kitchen and locked eyes with Daniel. He stopped wiping the counter, his gaze locking onto mine. He immediately saw the cold, rigid shift in my posture. I did not tell him what I had just done at David's house. I did not mention the slap or the shattered crystal. I simply told him I needed to step into my office to make a few urgent phone calls. I walked down the hall and closed the solid oak door of my office behind me. I sat down at my desk, my ultimate sanctuary of logic, numbers, and spreadsheets. I placed the plastic grocery bag containing my daughter's severed golden braid directly on the smooth glass surface. The sight of that thick blonde hair sitting next to my financial reports fueled a fire in my chest that burned hotter than 1,000 suns. Jasmine thought she had won a petty family rivalry. She thought she had successfully put my daughter in her place and reminded me of my subordinate status in the family hierarchy. She expected me to react with hysterical tears and loud outrage. She expected me to call my parents crying, which she would then expertly weaponize to play the victim as she always did. She relied completely on my parents' desperate need for social harmony to shield her from any real consequences. But Jasmine had made a fatal miscalculation. She had assumed I was bound by the same fragile social rules that governed Thomas and Barbara. She assumed my maternal instinct was passive and forgiving. She assumed I would prioritize family peace over my daughter's trauma. I did not just want an apology. I did not want a tense family mediation session where my parents forced everyone to hug and make peace for the sake of appearances. I wanted absolute total annihilation. I wanted to dismantle Jasmine's entire life so thoroughly that she would never recover. I wanted to expose the rotting foundation of my parents' fake progressive facade. I opened my laptop and booted up my auditing software. As the bright screen illuminated my face, I made a silent vow to the severed hair sitting on my desk. Jasmine wanted to take something precious from my family. Now I was going to take absolutely everything from hers. The era of keeping the peace was officially dead and buried. I stepped out of my office and walked back into the living room, where Daniel was sitting on the floor next to the couch. He had a damp cloth in his hand, and his jaw was clenched so tight the muscle twitched under his skin. He had finally gotten a close look at the jagged laceration on our daughter's ear while I was in my office. Daniel was not a man given to loud outbursts or reckless behavior. He was an architect of quiet strength, a pillar of absolute stability in my life. Right now, that stability was radiating a terrifying, simmering fury. He looked up at me, and his dark eyes communicated exactly what he was feeling. He did not need to ask me what happened. He saw the sheer violence etched into Lily's scalp and understood immediately that a line had been irreparably crossed. We spent the next hour entirely focused on Lily. We ordered her favorite pepperoni pizza and let her eat it right there on the couch while watching her favorite animated movie. Daniel sat beside her, wrapping his large arms around her small frame, acting as an impenetrable shield against the world. We praised her bravery. We told her she looked beautiful, even with the choppy, uneven hair. We made sure the only emotions she absorbed from us were absolute love and unwavering protection. She eventually fell asleep against Daniel's chest, exhausted by the traumatic ordeal. He carried her upstairs to her room, tucking her into bed with gentle precision. When he came back downstairs, he stood in the kitchen and looked at me. His voice was dangerously low. Jasmine did this. I nodded, confirming his realization. I went over there. I told him, my voice matching his cold intensity. I left a message. Daniel did not ask for details. He simply nodded, stepping forward to pull me into a tight embrace. We are going to destroy her, he stated, an absolute promise hanging in the quiet air of our kitchen. Before I could outline my plan, the shrill ring of my cell phone shattered the silence. I glanced at the screen. It was my mother, Barbara. I let it ring 3 times before accepting the call, putting it on speaker so Daniel could hear. I did not offer a greeting. Monica Thomas and I need you at our house right this instant. Barbara's voice crackled through the speaker, dripping with absolute venom. It was not a request. It was a vicious demand from a matriarch who felt her authority had been challenged. She did not ask how Lily was doing. She did not inquire about the bleeding cut on her granddaughter's ear or the brutal shearing of her hair. Her only concern was the disruption of her precious family peace. We are dealing with the aftermath of an assault on your granddaughter, I replied, maintaining my flat, professional tone. I am not leaving my house for a social call. You will get over here right now, my father Thomas barked, having grabbed the phone from my mother. David and Jasmine are here. You have completely lost your mind, Monica. You get over here and face what you have done before I call the police myself. Daniel reached forward and pressed the end call button, terminating the connection mid-sentence. He looked at me, his eyes narrowing with tactical focus. We go, he said. We go, and we see exactly how far they are willing to take this delusion. We asked our trusted neighbor to sit in our living room while Lily slept. Then Daniel and I drove the short distance to my parents' affluent suburban house. The drive was completely silent. We operated as a unified front, an unbreakable team preparing to walk directly into hostile territory. We pulled into the driveway and parked behind David's luxury sedan. I did not bother knocking when we reached the front door. I turned the handle and walked straight into the grand foyer, Daniel stepping in right behind me like a shadow. The scene in the living room was perfectly orchestrated theater. Jasmine was dramatically draped across my mother's expensive cream-colored velvet sofa, holding a decorative bag of frozen peas to her cheek. She was sobbing, producing loud theatrical gasps for air while clutching a tissue. David was pacing furiously back and forth across the Persian rug, playing the role of the protective, outraged husband. Thomas stood by the fireplace, arms crossed tightly over his chest, glaring at me as if I were a common criminal who had just broken into his home. Barbara hovered over Jasmine, offering her a glass of water and shooting me daggers. The atmosphere in the room was intensely hostile. The air felt thick with resentment and coordinated malice. This was not a family gathering to address a conflict and find the truth. This was a calculated ambush. They had already held their trial, rendered their verdict, and summoned me here exclusively for the sentencing phase. Look who finally decided to show up. David sneered, stopping his pacing to point a trembling finger at me. You are a psychopath, Monica. You are completely unhinged. Jasmine let out a loud wail, burying her face in Barbara's shoulder. My jaw hurt so bad she cried, her voice muffled by the expensive fabric of my mother's blouse. I cannot believe she attacked me in my own home. I was just trying to bond with her daughter. I stood in the center of the room, completely unbothered by the pathetic display. Daniel stood shoulder to shoulder with me, his physical presence demanding space and respect. I looked at Thomas and Barbara, waiting for them to acknowledge the reason this entire situation existed. I waited for my parents to ask about their 8-year-old granddaughter, who had come home mutilated and bleeding. They said absolutely nothing about Lily. Instead, Barbara gently patted Jasmine's back and leveled a look of pure disgust directly at my face. Are you completely out of your mind? Barbara shrieked, her voice echoing off the vaulted ceiling of the living room. You march over to this house like some kind of rabid animal and assault your sister-in-law. Over what? A haircut. I cannot even begin to comprehend how violent and unstable you have become, Monica. I kept my hands loosely clasped in front of me, maintaining a perfectly neutral posture. It was not a haircut, I stated clearly, articulating every single syllable. She pinned my 8-year-old daughter to a chair against her will. She hacked off her hair down to the scalp, and she drove a pair of heavy kitchen shears into her ear, with enough force to leave a deep laceration. That is physical assault. Oh, for heaven's sake, stop being so incredibly dramatic. Barbara scoffed, waving her hands in the air as if trying to physically bat away the truth. It was a normal scratch from playing. Children get scratched all the time when they are running around and roughhousing. Jasmine was simply trying to help Lily update her look. She was being a generous aunt, taking time out of her busy day to bond with your child. And how do you repay her kindness? You act like a complete sociopath and attack her in her own foyer. I stared at the woman who gave birth to me. The sheer scale of her delusion was breathtaking. She was actively looking at a grown woman who had just mutilated a child and somehow weaving a narrative where the abuser was a generous martyr and the protective mother was a deranged villain. Barbara did not care about the blood on my daughter's ear. She did not care about the psychological terror inflicted on a helpless 8-year-old. She only cared that I had shattered the fragile illusion of her perfect family. Jasmine whimpered loudly from the couch, pressing the frozen peas harder against her cheek. I was just trying to show her some new styles. She sniffled, her voice shaking with fake trauma. Lily was moving around so much because she is so spoiled and undisciplined. If she got a tiny little scratch, it is only because she refused to sit still like a normal, well-behaved child. I was trying to teach her about empathy and sharing the spotlight, but Monica clearly never taught her daughter any manners. Daniel shifted beside me, his large frame tensing like a coiled spring. He took one deliberate step forward, placing himself slightly in front of me. His voice when he spoke was dangerously quiet, a deep rumble that demanded absolute silence. "If you ever speak about my daughter again," he said, locking his dark eyes directly onto Jasmine's face, "I will personally ensure you never have the opportunity to speak at all. You assaulted a child. You are a coward and a predator." Thomas slammed his fist down on the expensive glass coffee table, causing the decorative vases to rattle. "Do not you dare come into my house and threaten my daughter-in-law." Daniel, my father, bellowed, his face turning a mottled shade of crimson. "You and Monica are completely out of line. You have lost your grip on reality. You coddle that kid too much, and now you are making up wild stories to justify Monica's unhinged, violent behavior." My father stepped away from the fireplace and marched toward us, his chest puffed out in a pathetic display of patriarchal authority. "Listen to me very closely, Monica," he growled. "You have embarrassed this family for the absolute last time. You have disrespected your brother, and you have viciously attacked his wife over a harmless, childish game. Jasmine is a prominent business owner in this community. She is a woman of color who already faces enough discrimination without her own sister-in-law violently assaulting her and trying to ruin her reputation. He was doing it again. Thomas was pulling out the race card, desperately trying to frame my reaction to child abuse as a discriminatory attack. He was utilizing Jasmine's favorite weapon to force me into submission, terrified that if he did not aggressively defend her, she would spin a narrative of prejudice against him to their country club friends. He was willing to throw his own flesh and blood under the bus to protect his precious social standing. "This family operates on respect," Thomas continued, his voice booming through the room. "And you have shown absolutely zero respect for the hierarchy of this household. Jasmine is a victim of your psychotic rage. She is sitting there bruised and traumatized because you cannot control your bitter jealousy." I looked at Jasmine. Behind the bag of frozen peas, her eyes met mine. The fake tears had stopped. A cold, victorious smirk danced across her lips. She knew exactly what she was doing. She was completely intoxicated by the power she held over my parents, watching them desperately dance to her tune while actively destroying their relationship with their own daughter. "So here is what is going to happen," Thomas commanded, crossing his arms and planting his feet. "You are going to walk over to that couch right now, Monica. You are going to get down on your knees, and you are going to beg Jasmine for her forgiveness. You are going to apologize for your violent outburst, and you are going to promise that you will never exhibit this kind of disrespectful behavior again. If you do not get on your knees and apologize to her immediately, you are dead to me." The demand hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. My own father was demanding that I kneel before the woman who had terrorized my child. He was ordering me to completely abandon my dignity, my maternal instincts, and my basic sense of reality, just to soothe the ego of a manipulative narcissist. He showed absolute disregard for his granddaughter's trauma. Lily's pain was entirely irrelevant to him. The only thing that mattered was restoring the fake peace of his carefully curated social theater. I felt a strange, profound sensation wash over me. It was not anger. It was not sorrow. It was absolute clinical detachment. The last invisible thread connecting me to Thomas and Barbara simply dissolved into dust. I looked at the two people who had raised me, and I felt nothing but a hollow, echoing void. They were no longer my parents. They were just two pathetic enablers trapped in a toxic prison of their own making. I did not move toward the couch. I did not drop to my knees. I stood perfectly still, processing the finality of my father's ultimatum. I memorized the layout of the room. I cataloged the arrogant smirk on my brother's face. I gathered every single data point necessary for the audit of their impending destruction. Daniel squeezed my hand, his thumb rubbing a steady rhythm across my knuckles. We were entirely in sync. The stage was set for the extortion, and I was more than ready to hear their demands. David stepped out from behind the sofa, his chest puffed out in a pathetic imitation of authority. He pointed a finger directly at my face. "You are not just walking away from this, Monica. You do not get to come into my home, assault my wife, and pretend nothing happened. We took pictures of her face. We have the red marks documented. My parents are witnesses to your unhinged state. I have the phone in my pocket right now, and I am one button away from calling the police and having you arrested for felony assault." I watched him perform. He actually thought he was intimidating. He actually believed his threats carried weight. "Let me remind you what a criminal record does to a senior financial auditor." David continued, his voice dripping with condescension. "You lose your certifications. You lose your license. Your firm fires you before the ink on the police report even dries. You will never work in finance again. Daniel and Lily will have to watch you get dragged out of here in handcuffs. All because you could not control your psychotic jealousy over a simple haircut." The sheer audacity of his speech was almost impressive. He was laying out a blueprint to destroy my career and my life, while standing in a house my parents bought for him. He was threatening to strip away the livelihood I used to feed my child, all to protect the woman who had just terrorized that very same child. Barbara nodded vigorously from the corner. "You need to listen to your brother, Monica. Actions have consequences. You brought this entirely on yourself." Then Jasmine let out a heavy, dramatic sigh. She lowered the bag of frozen peas from her cheek and looked at me with a sickening display of false magnanimity. "David, wait," she said, placing a gentle hand on his forearm. "I do not want to see her go to jail. I do not want to tear this family apart completely. I am a forgiving person. I believe in restorative justice." I almost laughed. Restorative justice. She was throwing around buzzwords she had picked up online to mask her absolute greed. I kept my face blank, waiting for the punchline. I knew it was coming. An auditor always knows when the bill is about to be presented. Jasmine shifted her weight on the velvet cushions, sitting up a little straighter. "My salon has been struggling recently," she began, her voice adopting a tragically brave tone. "The stress of dealing with your constant hostility and your refusal to support a minority-owned business has taken a severe toll on my mental health. My doctors have recommended I take time off to heal and rebuild my spirit. But with the overhead costs of the salon, I simply cannot afford to step away. Now, after you physically attacked me in my own foyer, I am deeply traumatized. I cannot show my face to my clients with these bruises. My business is going to suffer massive financial losses because of your violent actions." She paused, letting her fabricated sob story hang in the air. Thomas looked at her with pure pity. David wrapped his arm around her shoulders, acting like a valiant defender. So Jasmine continued, her eyes locking onto mine with the cold, dead gaze of a shark. "I am willing to offer you a compromise, Monica. I will not press charges. I will not call the police and ruin your precious career. I will even forgive you for what you did to me today. But actions require restitution. I require $50,000 in emotional damages and compensation for lost business revenue." The silence in the room was absolute. Even Daniel let out a low breath beside me, processing the sheer staggering scale of her brazen extortion. $50,000. "You can consider it a late investment in my salon." Jasmine added a smug smile, fighting to break through her victim facade. "Or you can consider it the cost of keeping yourself out of a prison cell. Either way, you write me a check for $50,000 by tomorrow morning, and we sweep this entire ugly incident under the rug. You get to keep your auditing licenses, and I get the financial space I need to heal from your physical abuse." David nodded in firm agreement. "It is a completely fair deal, Monica. $50,000 is pocket change for you and Daniel. You pay my wife for the damages you caused, or I make the call and the police walk you out of here in cuffs. The choice is yours." Every syllable out of Jasmine's mouth was a masterclass in narcissistic delusion. She was demanding a ransom. That was the raw, unvarnished truth of the situation. She had held my child hostage in a styling chair, hacked off her hair, sliced her ear open, and was now demanding a $50,000 payout to absolve me of the crime of reacting. The sheer audacity of the extortion attempt laid bare the rotting core of my family. They did not see right or wrong. They only saw leverage and financial gain. My mother, Barbara, even had the nerve to chime in. $50,000 is a small price to pay for family unity, Monica. You and Daniel have plenty in savings. Think of it as a peace offering, a way to finally show support for your sister-in-law and wipe the slate clean. If you just write the check, we can all move forward and put this terrible day behind us. I stared at the four adults standing in that opulent living room. My brain rapidly processed the legal and financial reality of what had just occurred. They were completely oblivious to the law. David and Jasmine had just committed felony extortion right in front of two witnesses. They had explicitly tied a demand for $50,000 to a threat of criminal prosecution. It was a textbook shakedown, a crime far more severe than a simple slap across the face. And the most sickening part was that my parents, Thomas and Barbara, stood there, nodding in total agreement. They actually believed this was a reasonable solution. They were perfectly willing to watch their golden boy and his manipulative wife extort $50,000 from their own daughter to fund a failing vanity project. They were putting a literal price tag on Lily's trauma. They had decided that my daughter's physical assault and emotional devastation were worth exactly $50,000 to keep Jasmine's salon afloat. The mathematical stupidity of their plan was matched only by their breathtaking cruelty. They assumed I would panic. They assumed I valued my spotless career so much that I would blindly hand over the money to make the threat go away. They thought they had cornered me. They thought they had finally found a way to siphon my hard-earned money into Jasmine's bottomless pit of debt. I did not argue. I did not point out the felony they had just committed. I did not try to reason with Thomas and Barbara. Giving them a legal education was not my responsibility. My only responsibility was completely annihilating them. I looked directly at Jasmine. The red handprint was still stark against her cheek, a permanent reminder of the moment she pushed me too far. I looked at David, puffed up with unearned arrogance. I looked at my parents, who had utterly failed their most basic duty to protect their grandchild. Daniel shifted his weight, preparing to intervene, but I placed my hand flat against his chest, signaling him to hold. I did not need him to fight this battle. I had everything I needed right here. The audit was open, and their debts were about to be collected in full. I looked at my mother. Barbara stood there with her hands clasped together, leaning slightly forward with a sickening expression of hopeful greed painted across her face. She was practically vibrating with the anticipation of me submitting to their demands. She truly believed that because I had always been the responsible one, the one who paid my own way and fixed my own problems, I would simply write a check to maintain the illusion of her flawless family. She looked at me not as a daughter who was hurting, but as a human ATM machine, a convenient financial mechanism to solve the massive problem Jasmine and David had created. I shifted my gaze to my father. Thomas had his chin raised, his shoulders squared in that domineering posture he always assumed when he felt he was winning a negotiation. He had just facilitated the extortion of his own flesh and blood, and he looked overwhelmingly proud of himself. He looked like a man who had successfully brokered a difficult corporate merger, totally blind to the sheer moral depravity of the transaction. There was no love in his eyes. There was only the cold, hard calculation of a man protecting his social investments. In that precise moment, the very last thread of familial attachment I held for these people snapped. It did not tear slowly. It did not unravel over time. It severed completely with a clean, resounding finality. Any lingering childhood hope that they might one day wake up and choose to protect me completely evaporated into the sterile air of their extravagant living room. I realized with absolute terrifying clarity that they were a complete and total lost cause. There was no combination of words, no emotional plea, and no display of genuine agony that would ever pierce the thick armor of their narcissism. They were empty vessels fueled entirely by the perception of their country club peers. I did not break down. I did not shed a single tear. I did not allow my voice to tremble or my knees to shake. Inside my chest, the coiled spring of decades of suppressed resentment, suffocating injustice, and silent endurance compressed to its absolute physical limit. It wound tighter and tighter, locking into place with a heavy metallic click. The pressure was immense, but it was not chaotic. It was focused, concentrated, and incredibly lethal. I was no longer a grieving mother or a disappointed daughter. I was an executioner standing in a room full of people who had just gleefully handed me the rope. Daniel felt the shift in my posture. He felt the exact second the emotional warmth drained from my body, leaving behind nothing but glacial resolve. He stepped up beside me, closing the tiny gap between us. He wrapped his large protective arm around my waist, anchoring me to the floor and pulling me firmly against his side. His physical presence was a massive shield, a silent vow that he would back my play regardless of the collateral damage. He did not say a word to my parents. He did not need to. His dark eyes swept over the four of them with such concentrated disgust that even David took a hesitant half-step backward. I looked at Jasmine. She was still clutching her bag of frozen peas, her lips parted in a greedy, expectant smile. She was waiting for me to pull out my checkbook. She was waiting for the ultimate submission. I looked at David, who was nodding slowly, urging me to comply. I looked at Thomas and Barbara, who stood united in their profound betrayal. I took a slow, deep breath, letting the silence stretch until it became heavy and suffocating. The tension in the living room morphed from triumphant anticipation into a sudden creeping unease. They expected me to yell. They expected me to cry and beg for a lower amount. They expected a negotiation. When I finally spoke, my voice was a deadly calm whisper that easily carried across the vast expanse of the living room. It held no anger. It held no sorrow. It was the voice of a judge reading a final, irreversible verdict. "If you have chosen your side," I said, articulating every single word with chilling precision, "prepare to suffer the consequences." The air in the room instantly froze. The smug smile on Jasmine's face faltered for a fraction of a second, replaced by a brief flash of primal confusion. Thomas opened his mouth, his brow furrowing as he tried to process the absolute lack of fear in my tone. David blinked, stepping forward as if he wanted to block our path. But I did not give them a chance to respond. I did not give them the satisfaction of a prolonged debate. I simply turned on my heel, my shoulder brushing against Daniel's chest as we moved in perfect unison. We walked toward the grand double doors, our footsteps echoing loudly against the imported hardwood floors. "Wait!" Thomas barked, his voice laced with a sudden, uncharacteristic panic. "Monica, where are you going? We are not finished here. You have until tomorrow morning to bring that check, or David is calling the police." I did not pause. I did not look back. Daniel reached out and pulled the heavy oak door open, the crisp autumn wind rushing into the stagnant, suffocating heat of the house. "Let her go." David sneered, his voice carrying out onto the porch as we stepped over the threshold. "She is just bluffing. She is terrified of losing her precious auditing license. She will be back here first thing in the morning with her tail between her legs and a cashier's check in her hand. She knows she has no other choice." Barbara chimed in, her tone dripping with arrogant certainty. "Exactly. She just needs a night to cool down and realize how serious this is. She will do the right thing to protect her career. They always come around when their own comfort is on the line." Daniel closed the door behind us with a solid, heavy thud, sealing their arrogant voices inside their $2 million echo chamber. We walked down the custom stone pathway, exactly as we had arrived, moving with quiet, purposeful strides. I did not run. I did not rush. I walked to the passenger side of my car and slid into the seat, the plastic grocery bag containing Lily's severed blonde braid resting heavily against my thigh. Daniel got into the driver's seat, gripping the steering wheel. He turned to look at me, his chest heaving slightly as he processed the monumental betrayal we had just witnessed. "They actually think they won," he said, his voice laced with absolute disbelief. "They think you are going to pay them." I stared straight ahead through the windshield, looking at the massive brick facade of the house my parents had bought for the brother who was currently trying to extort me. A slow, dark smile spread across my face. It was a smile completely devoid of joy. "Let them think they won," I replied, my voice as smooth and cold as polished glass. "Let them sleep incredibly well tonight. Because tomorrow morning, when the sun comes up, we are going to burn their entire world to the ground." The morning sun filtered through the blinds of our bedroom, casting long, sharp shadows across the floorboard. I had not slept a single minute. Instead, I had spent the entire night sitting at my desk, outlining the financial and legal blueprint of my retaliation. Daniel had stayed upstairs holding our daughter as she slept through the night, occasionally waking to check the locks on our doors. When dawn finally broke, the time for silent planning ended. The execution phase began. Our first objective was irrefutable documentation. My entire career as an auditor relies on the principle that words are meaningless without a paper trail. Jasmine and David believed they could extort me because they thought it was just a family dispute, a case of my word against theirs. They were relying on my parents to act as witnesses to frame me as the aggressor. But a family dispute evaporates the moment forensic medical evidence enters the equation. I walked into Lily's bedroom. She was sitting up in bed, rubbing her eyes. The harsh reality of her hacked-off hair was even more shocking in the morning light. The jagged patches looked violently torn, and the dried blood on her ear stood out fiercely against her pale skin. I forced a warm, reassuring smile onto my face, hiding the cold fury that dictated my every movement. I told her we were going to see Dr. Harrison just to make sure her ear was healing properly. Daniel gently helped her into her favorite yellow sweater, making sure the fabric did not brush against the wound. The drive to the pediatric clinic was swift. Dr. Harrison had been Lily's primary care physician since the day she was born. He was a meticulous man in his late 50s, known for his calm demeanor and absolute clinical precision. I had called his emergency line before the clinic even opened, demanding the first available slot and briefly mentioning a physical trauma. When we walked into the brightly lit examination room, Dr. Harrison took one look at my daughter, and his welcoming smile completely vanished. The jovial pediatrician disappeared instantly, replaced by a sharp-focused medical professional. He knelt down in front of Lily, asking her gentle questions about her breakfast and her favorite cartoons, keeping her entirely at ease. Then he put on a pair of blue latex gloves and carefully turned her head to the side. The examination room was dead silent, save for the hum of the air conditioning unit. Daniel stood by the door, his arms crossed, watching the doctor with intense vigilance. I stood right beside the examination table, my eyes tracking every single movement the doctor made. Dr. Harrison spent several minutes examining the jagged edges of Lily's hair. He noted the erratic nature of the cuts, observing how the hair had been sheared dangerously close to the scalp in random, disorganized chunks. Then he focused his attention entirely on the laceration just above her left ear. He used a small medical light to illuminate the wound, carefully cleaning away the dried blood with an antiseptic wipe. As the raw, open cut was revealed, his jaw tightened. He asked Lily exactly how it happened. Lily, swinging her legs off the edge of the examination table, answered with the innocent clarity only a child possesses. She explained how Auntie Jasmine had pushed her down into the chair. She described how she had tried to pull away because it hurt, but her aunt had held her head down real hard and squeezed the big metal scissors right next to her skin. Dr. Harrison stood up, stripping off the latex gloves and tossing them into the waste bin. He turned to look at Daniel and me, his expression completely grim. This was not a childhood accident. He stated, his voice carrying the heavy weight of absolute medical certainty. The cartilage of the upper ear is remarkably tough. A superficial scrape or a minor slip of a pair of scissors would cause a shallow nick. But this laceration is deep and incredibly deliberate. He walked over to his computer station, pulling up Lily's digital medical file. He began typing rapidly, documenting every single detail of his physical examination. In order to cause a wound of this specific depth and angle with a blunt instrument like heavy shears, the perpetrator had to apply immense downward force directly against the child's skull, he explained, outlining the biomechanics of the injury. The trajectory of the blade indicates that the child was physically restrained and aggressively pinned down against her will. The sheer mechanical pressure required to slice through the skin and graze the cartilage like this proves beyond any shadow of a medical doubt that this was an act of intense forceful coercion. The clinical validation of the assault hit the room like a shockwave. Hearing a medical expert articulate the exact violent physics of what Jasmine had done to my little girl validated every ounce of rage I held in my chest. It was no longer just my maternal instinct screaming that a line had been crossed. It was a verifiable, documented scientific fact. Jasmine had not just given a bad haircut. She had utilized brute physical force to terrorize and physically injure a helpless 8-year-old. Dr. Harrison stopped typing and looked directly at me. As a licensed medical professional, I am a mandated reporter, he informed us, his tone shifting into formal legal territory. Based on the physical evidence on your daughter's scalp and the mechanics of the laceration on her ear, I am legally obligated to file an official report of suspected child abuse with the state authorities. This goes beyond a family disagreement, Monica. This is a documented physical assault on a minor. I did not flinch. I did not ask him to reconsider or keep it quiet. I nodded my head in absolute agreement. Do it, I instructed him, my voice ringing with icy resolve. I want every single detail of that physical restraint and the forceful laceration heavily documented in her permanent medical record. I want the exact depth of the cut and the psychological implications of her being pinned down officially logged. He printed out the detailed medical evaluation, handing me a thick stack of official hospital documents. They were stamped, signed, and legally binding. This was not a flimsy photograph taken on a cell phone or a bag of frozen peas used as a theatrical prop in my parents' living room. This was an indisputable medical verdict. It was the first piece of heavy artillery in my growing arsenal. Daniel took Lily's hand, helping her hop down from the examination table. We thanked Dr. Harrison for his thoroughness and walked out of the clinic, the bright morning sun blinding us as we stepped into the parking lot. I held the medical dossier tightly against my chest. Jasmine and David thought they held all the cards because they had my parents' blind financial and social backing. They thought they could extort $50,000 from me by threatening my professional auditing license. But they had fundamentally misunderstood the nature of the woman they were dealing with. They brought threats and temper tantrums to a battlefield. I was bringing undeniable, legally binding medical evidence. I slipped the folder into my briefcase, resting in the back seat of the car. The physical abuse had been officially proven and documented by the state. Now it was time to deploy my specific set of skills. It was time to follow the money and uncover exactly why a 35-year-old woman was desperate enough to harvest a child's hair. I opened my laptop in the passenger seat as Daniel started the engine. The financial audit of Jasmine's failing empire was officially underway. I sat in the passenger seat of our car, watching the suburban landscape blur past my window while my fingers flew across my laptop keyboard. Daniel drove us home in absolute silence, respecting the cold, intense focus radiating from my side of the vehicle. By the time we pulled into our driveway, I had already bypassed the basic search engines and accessed the specialized financial databases my firm utilized for corporate risk assessment. I walked straight through the front door, bypassing the kitchen, and headed directly into my home office. I locked the heavy wooden door behind me. I needed absolute isolation. I needed an environment completely devoid of emotion because what I was about to do required the surgical precision of a financial predator. People like Jasmine operate entirely on illusion. They build massive, towering facades of wealth and success, using nothing but arrogance and borrowed money. They rely on the polite social conditioning of those around them to never question the foundation of their grand display. But I am a senior financial auditor. I do not look at designer handbags or imported styling chairs. I look at balance sheets, tax liens, and cash flow statements. I look at the brutal, unforgiving mathematics of reality. Numbers do not care about your race, your gender, or your expertly crafted victim narrative. Numbers only tell the absolute truth, and I was about to extract every single ugly truth Jasmine had buried. I started with the most accessible layer, which was public records. I logged into the state business registry and pulled the foundational documents for her luxury salon. The business was registered as an LLC, solely under Jasmine's name, though the initial capital injection clearly traced back to the quiet bailout my parents had provided 2 years ago. From there, I accessed the county clerk's database to search for uniform commercial code filings. The results populated on my screen in a rapid cascading list of financial distress. Jasmine did not own a single piece of equipment in that sprawling downtown salon. Every imported styling chair, every crystal chandelier, every high-end hair washing station was heavily financed and currently saddled with active liens. She was leasing her entire persona. But equipment financing is standard for new businesses. I needed to see the operational bleeding. I dug deeper, rooting my search through the comprehensive credit risk networks my corporate job allowed me to access. These databases aggregate payment histories from commercial suppliers, giving a painfully clear picture of a business's actual liquidity. The credit profile for Jasmine's salon was an absolute massacre. The screen flashed with red warning indicators. Her accounts with major beauty suppliers were severely delinquent. She had unpaid invoices stretching back 8 months. 2 premium hair color distributors had already placed her accounts into active collections. She was completely cut off from wholesale supply chains, forced to buy products at retail prices, which further decimated her non-existent profit margins. I cross-referenced the delinquent vendor list with the local commercial court dockets. 3 separate suppliers had recently filed civil suits for breach of contract. But unpaid vendors were just the surface wounds. I needed to find the mortal blow. I analyzed her commercial credit utilization and found exactly what I was looking for. Jasmine had maxed out 4 separate high-limit business credit cards. When traditional credit lines evaporated, she turned to the absolute bottom of the financial barrel. The database showed 3 distinct merchant cash advances taken out over the last 90 days. Merchant cash advances are not traditional loans. They are predatory high-interest capital injections designed for desperate business owners who have completely run out of options. The lenders front a lump sum of cash, and in return, they take a massive fixed percentage of the business's daily credit card sales directly out of the merchant account. The interest rates often exceed 60% annually. It is a death spiral. Once a business relies on a merchant cash advance, they are effectively drowning, taking on new predatory debt just to pay off the old debt. I sat back in my desk chair, the blue light of the monitor reflecting in my eyes. The mathematics of Jasmine's desperation laid themselves bare across my screen. The daily draws from the predatory lenders were draining her operating accounts dry. She needed a massive influx of untethered liquid cash simply to keep the lights on and prevent a commercial eviction. Suddenly, the scene in my parents' living room took on an entirely new level of sinister clarity. The $50,000 demand for emotional damages was not just a random number she pulled out of thin air to punish me. It was a highly calculated ransom. She had looked at the violent assault she committed against my 8-year-old daughter and instantly recognized a golden opportunity to extort the exact amount of capital she needed to satisfy her aggressive creditors. She weaponized her own cruelty, turning my daughter's trauma into a twisted fundraising strategy to save her vanity project from total collapse. My parents, Thomas and Barbara, were eagerly participating in this extortion, completely blind to the fact that they were bailing out a sinking ship. They thought they were maintaining family harmony by forcing me to pay off my sister-in-law. They had no idea they were simply feeding a financial black hole. I rubbed my temples, my mind working at lightning speed. The vendor debts and the predatory loans painted a picture of a woman backed into a corner fighting for her social survival. But to pull off a launch party for a new product line which she was currently advertising all over social media, she needed an immediate secondary cash flow. The $50,000 she tried to extort from me had not materialized, so she must have found another source of capital to fund her extravagant upcoming event. I leaned forward, resting my fingers on the keyboard. I needed to see the granular movement of her immediate cash flow. I bypassed the broad credit profiles and utilized a backdoor connection through a third-party payment processor I had audited last quarter. It was a gray area professionally, but I was long past caring about corporate boundaries. I isolated the incoming transaction logs for her business accounts over the past 48 hours. I needed to know exactly how she was keeping the wolves at bay this week. I scrolled through the ledger lines of minor customer payments, small deposits that barely covered the daily loan deductions. Then a specific transaction caught my eye. It was an incoming wire transfer processed yesterday afternoon, just hours after Lily had been dropped off at my house. I stared at the origin routing number and the transaction amount. The puzzle pieces shifted, aligning to form a picture so depraved it made my stomach physically churn. The audit was about to reveal the absolute darkest corner of Jasmine's soul. The transaction log on my screen displayed an incoming wire transfer of exactly $3,000. The funds had cleared into Jasmine's primary business operating account at precisely 2:15 yesterday afternoon. I leaned closer to the monitor, the blue light casting a harsh glow across my face in the dim office. The sender was not a standard client booking a haircut or a vendor issuing a refund. The routing information belonged to a corporate entity registered under the name Crown Heritage Extensions Incorporated. My fingers flew across the keyboard, pulling up the corporate registry for the state of Illinois and cross-referencing the business entity. Crown Heritage Extensions was not a beauty supply store. They were an elite boutique manufacturer located in an upscale district of Chicago. I navigated to their official website, and the reality of their business model hit me like a physical blow to the chest. They specialized in the creation of bespoke, high-end human hair wigs and premium extensions for wealthy clients. Their homepage boasted about sourcing only the finest untreated virgin hair, explicitly highlighting their demand for natural golden blonde shades, which commanded the highest premium on the luxury market. I sat frozen in my office chair, staring at the bold, sophisticated typography on the screen. The pieces of the puzzle slammed together with a sickening, terrifying violence. The entire cousin spa day had been a carefully orchestrated trap. Jasmine had not invited Lily over to bond. She had not hacked off my daughter's hair merely out of deep-seated jealousy or a twisted desire to make Riley the prettier child. Those were just the convenient excuses she used to mask her true motive. Jasmine was drowning in predatory debt, facing aggressive collection agencies and dodging multiple civil lawsuits. She was desperate for an immediate influx of untethered cash to keep her failing salon from collapsing. And she had looked at my 8-year-old daughter and seen nothing but a walking biological asset ready to be harvested and liquidated. I turned my head and looked at the plastic grocery bag resting on the glass surface of my desk. I reached out and pulled open the crinkled plastic handles, staring down at the thick golden braid coiled inside. The heavy scent of cheap salon chemicals filled the air. My analytical mind kicked into high gear, calculating physical volume and mass. Lily possessed an incredible amount of hair, thick, heavy, and stretching all the way down to her waist. The single ruined braid sitting in this bag represented a mere fraction of the total volume that had been removed from her head. The horrifying truth washed over me, leaving a trail of absolute disgust in its wake. Jasmine had meticulously sectioned off the densest, longest, and most pristine underlayers of my daughter's hair. She had harvested the premium bulk, the exact virgin material that a luxury wig manufacturer would pay top dollar to acquire. She had sold the majority of Lily's hair directly to a local buyer for $3,000 in cold, hard cash. To cover her tracks and inflict maximum psychological damage, she had chemically ruined the top layers, chopping them into the single messy braid I now held in my hand, giving it back to Lily as a cruel, sadistic decoy. Suddenly, the violent physical mechanics of the assault made perfect, chilling sense. Dr. Harrison had noted that the laceration above Lily's ear required immense downward force and aggressive restraint. Jasmine had not just been careless with the kitchen shears. She had been greedy. In the luxury hair extension market, every single inch of length significantly increases the payout value. Jasmine had pinned my terrified, struggling child to the chair and driven the heavy metal blades as close to the scalp as physically possible, desperate to maximize her profit margin. She had sliced open an 8-year-old girl's ear and drawn blood simply because she wanted a few more inches of blonde hair to sell to the highest bidder. She had monetized my child. She had physically violated a minor committing bodily theft to satisfy a merchant cash advance. This was no longer a domestic dispute or a case of simple familial assault. Harvesting biological material from a child without parental consent for direct financial gain crossed multiple severe legal thresholds. It escalated the crime to commercial exploitation and child abuse for profit. Jasmine had effectively trafficked a piece of my daughter's body to save her own pathetic vanity project. My breathing slowed, matching the steady mechanical rhythm of my pounding heart. The raw, fiery rage I had felt earlier distilled into something infinitely more dangerous. It transformed into a cold, weaponized clarity. I opened a new encrypted folder on my desktop and began rapidly downloading every single piece of digital evidence. I pulled the exact timestamp of the $3,000 wire transfer. I captured the corporate registration details of the wig manufacturer. I saved the predatory loan agreements and the terrifying vendor lawsuits currently suffocating Jasmine's business. I bound this mountain of financial data together with the official medical evaluation I had secured from Dr. Harrison just hours ago. The pediatrician's report detailing the forceful restraint and the deliberate laceration formed the undeniable physical foundation of the crime. The financial audit provided the indisputable motive. Together they created a flawless, airtight dossier of utter destruction. Jasmine believed her absolute worst crime was being a mean aunt. She thought she could hide behind my parents' desperate need for social harmony, using her usual tactics of crying discrimination to escape accountability. She truly believed she had outsmarted me, pocketing $3,000 to fund her extravagant lifestyle while leaving my daughter traumatized and bleeding. I clicked save on the final document and closed my laptop. The blue glow vanished, leaving the office bathed in the soft afternoon light. The financial investigation was entirely complete. I had uncovered the ultimate sickness rotting inside my sister-in-law. She had traded her basic humanity for a quick payout, underestimating the profound wrath of a mother who understood exactly how to follow the money. I locked the evidence away in my secure server. The trap was now fully loaded, and I was perfectly positioned to execute the final devastating phase of my plan. The trap was indeed fully loaded, but my financial instincts were still humming with a restless, demanding energy. A seasoned auditor never walks away from a ledger until every single discrepancy is entirely resolved. While I was tracking the vile $3,000 wire transfer from the luxury wig manufacturer, I had noticed a peripheral pattern in Jasmine's primary operating account. It was a rhythmic pulse of incoming cash that simply did not match the erratic, desperate behavior of her predatory loans. I reopened my auditing software and expanded the search parameters to encompass the entire 2-year financial history of her luxury salon. I needed to see the complete macro picture of this failing enterprise. The data populated instantly across my dual monitors. Mixed among the failing retail sales and the aggressive daily draws from the merchant cash advances were massive recurring deposits. These were not small personal transfers or simple family loans. They were heavy structured corporate injections of $20,000 and $30,000 at a time. I traced the routing numbers back to their exact point of origin. My blood ran completely cold. The money was flowing directly from the primary business accounts of my parents' real estate firm. Thomas and Barbara had proudly built their company over 4 decades, establishing a comfortable wealth that allowed them to fund their precious social image and command respect in their elite circles. Now their corporate accounts were bleeding out into Jasmine's failing vanity project. I knew my parents had secretly funded the initial opening of the salon 2 years ago. But these recurring transfers were recent, continuous, and escalating rapidly in volume. I pulled the public corporate filings for my parents' real estate company. David had been named a junior vice president 3 years ago, a fabricated title my father bestowed upon him simply to justify an unearned 6-figure salary. That specific title gave David authorized administrative access to the corporate banking portals. I matched the outgoing transfer dates with the internal accounting records I could access through standard corporate transparency checks. David and Jasmine had not just taken a loan from my parents. They had orchestrated a systematic long-term financial drain. They masked the massive theft under a series of fabricated vendor expenses. The ledger showed monthly outgoing payments labeled as luxury staging consultation fees and property enhancement marketing. These payments were supposedly compensating Jasmine's salon for preparing high-end properties for the real estate market. It was a complete and utter fabrication. Jasmine was barely capable of managing a haircut, let alone providing corporate-level real estate staging for luxury homes. David was actively abusing his administrative access to approve fraudulent invoices generated by his wife. He was funneling massive amounts of liquid capital directly out of his parents' company and dropping it straight into the black hole of Jasmine's debt. I ran a cumulative summation script on the fraudulent consulting fees over the 24-month period. The final number flashed on my screen in bold red text: $800,000. David and Jasmine had embezzled nearly $1 million from Thomas and Barbara, but a regional real estate company running on standard margins could not sustain an $800,000 unauthorized hemorrhage without the primary operating accounts going negative. So where was the liquidity actually coming from? I dug into the cross-account transfer logs, and the reality of the situation was staggering. David was not just draining operating capital. He was manually liquidating Thomas and Barbara's private retirement portfolios to cover the massive cash transfers. My parents had spent their entire adult lives accumulating that wealth to secure their golden years and maintain their country club status. David was systematically wiping it out to pay for imported styling chairs, unpaid vendor invoices, and his wife's designer lounge sets. The sheer financial violence of his actions was breathtaking. But the devastation did not end with the empty retirement accounts. When operating cash and retirement funds are completely depleted, the next logical step in a financial collapse is massive default on hard assets. I pulled up the county property tax databases and the current foreclosure registry for their affluent suburban zip code. I entered my parents' home address into the search bar. The result populated immediately with a glaring red legal notice. The sprawling estate where Thomas and Barbara hosted their lavish dinners, the very same house where they had just arrogantly demanded I drop to my knees and apologize to my daughter's abuser, was officially listed in active pre-foreclosure. They were 3 months behind on their primary mortgage payments. The bank had already filed the preliminary paperwork to seize the property. My parents were completely broke. Their entire kingdom was a hollow, decaying shell, and they did not even know it yet. The profound irony of the situation hit me with the physical force of a freight train. Just hours ago, Thomas had puffed out his chest and ordered me to pay a $50,000 extortion fee to protect his precious family image. Barbara had smugly claimed that $50,000 was a small price to pay for family unity. They were defending David and Jasmine with vicious, absolute loyalty. They were willing to sacrifice my career, my financial stability, and my 8-year-old daughter's physical safety to protect the golden couple. And all the while, that very same golden couple was actively driving them into total irreversible bankruptcy. Thomas and Barbara were fiercely guarding the absolute worst parasites in their lives. They were shielding the exact people who had stolen their retirement and doomed them to lose their home. I captured the property foreclosure notices, the fabricated consulting invoices, and the cumulative embezzlement ledger. I compiled everything into a secondary master file. Jasmine had committed an unforgivable physical assault on my child for $3,000. David had committed federal wire fraud and grand larceny to the tune of $800,000 against his own parents. The extortion attempt they tried to pull on me earlier today was nothing but a desperate thrashing attempt to find new victims before their entire house of cards collapsed. They needed my money because they had finally bled my parents completely dry. I exported the massive audit file and secured it on a portable flash drive. The weapon was forged, sharpened, and dipped in absolute financial poison. I turned off my computer and stood up from my desk. The sun had set, leaving the room bathed in shadows. Tomorrow night, Jasmine was hosting a highly publicized event to launch a new product line. It was the perfect stage for a public execution. The air inside Jasmine's luxury salon was thick with the scent of expensive floral arrangements and desperate ambition. 24 hours had passed since I locked my audit file away, and now I stood across the street with Daniel watching the preparations for her launch party. Jasmine had rented luxury sedans to valet park her guests' vehicles. She had hired a local catering company known for charging exorbitant prices for tiny portions of food. The floor-to-ceiling windows of the salon glowed with a warm golden light, showcasing the massive crystal chandeliers she had purchased using my parents' stolen retirement funds. A massive silk banner hung across the back wall of the salon displaying the name of her new venture. It was a boutique children's hair care line. The absolute sickening irony made my jaw clench. The woman who had violently pinned down my 8-year-old daughter to harvest her hair for profit was now standing under a spotlight preparing to sell organic detangling spray to the wealthy mothers of Chicago. She was monetizing childhood innocence while actively operating as a child abuser. Daniel and I waited in the shadows, letting the venue fill before making our entrance. I wore a tailored emerald green suit that projected absolute corporate authority. Daniel stood beside me in a sharp charcoal blazer, his presence a silent, imposing wall of support. We watched the elite members of my parents' suburban country club arrive in their designer coats and glittering jewelry. These were the people Thomas and Barbara desperately wanted to impress. These were the social judges my parents worshipped, and Jasmine had invited every single one of them to witness her fabricated triumph. We crossed the street and walked through the heavy glass doors of the salon. The sheer scale of the financial waste inside was staggering. Waiters navigated through the crowd carrying silver trays loaded with champagne flutes and miniature caviar tarts. A professional string quartet played soft classical music in the corner, adding a layer of artificial sophistication to the room. I kept my hands empty and my focus entirely sharp. Near the center of the room, Thomas and Barbara were holding court. My parents were in their absolute element, soaking up the attention and radiating a toxic, blinding arrogance. Thomas wore a custom-tailored tuxedo, holding a glass of scotch and laughing loudly at a joke made by a prominent local judge. Barbara wore a diamond necklace that had been in our family for generations, completely unaware the very bank holding her mortgage was preparing to evict her. I stepped closer, blending into the crowd to listen to their performance. Barbara was gently touching the arm of a wealthy socialite friend, her voice dripping with manufactured pride. "Jasmine is just so incredibly brilliant," Barbara boasted, gesturing toward the stage, where my sister-in-law was posing for photographs. "She has such an incredible mind for business." She identified a massive gap in the luxury market for safe organic children's hair products and completely capitalized on it. David has been helping her manage the corporate expansion. They are such a powerhouse couple. The socialite nodded enthusiastically, sipping her champagne. "It is so wonderful to see young entrepreneurs thriving. You must be so proud of David for supporting a minority-owned business venture. He is a wonderful husband, Barbara." Thomas puffed out his chest, inserting himself seamlessly into the conversation. "David learned everything he knows about financial management from me," Thomas declared with absolute unearned authority. "I taught him how to leverage assets and maximize liquidity. It takes real strategic vision to launch a luxury brand in this economic climate, but David and Jasmine have executed it flawlessly. We could not be happier with the direction they are taking the family legacy." I stood mere feet away, listening to the man who was currently $90,000 in debt on his primary mortgage brag about liquidity and strategic vision. Thomas was actively praising the exact same financial strategy that had completely emptied his life savings. He was crediting his son for a brilliant business maneuver that was in reality federal wire fraud and grand larceny committed directly against his own accounts. The sheer magnitude of their delusion was almost mesmerizing. They were standing on the deck of a sinking ship, demanding that their friends admire the paint job. David was circulating through the crowd near the bar, playing the role of the devoted, wealthy investor husband. He shook hands with local politicians and smiled for the cameras, projecting an aura of total financial invincibility. He looked so incredibly pleased with himself, so confident that his massive theft would remain hidden forever. He truly believed he had outsmarted everyone. He thought he could steal nearly $1 million from his parents, throw a lavish party to validate his wife's ego, and walk away without a single consequence. Near the stage, Jasmine was orchestrating a photo shoot with her daughter. Riley was stuffed into an itchy-looking sequence dress, her hair heavily sprayed and styled into a stiff, unnatural tower of curls. The 8-year-old girl looked absolutely miserable, her eyes tired and vacant, as her mother forcefully repositioned her shoulders for the cameras. Jasmine crouched next to her daughter, flashing a brilliant wide smile for the hired photographer, playing the role of the loving, attentive mother. She used Riley as a prop just as easily as she used my parents' money. I caught Daniel's eye across the room. He gave me a single subtle nod. The venue was packed. The champagne was flowing. The social circle Thomas and Barbara worshipped was captive and paying full attention. The stage was perfectly set. The audience was seated and the actors were in place. I adjusted the lapels of my emerald suit and began walking purposefully toward the front of the room. It was time to pull the curtain down on this pathetic charade. I moved past the waiters and the elite guests. Daniel matched my pace, step for step. The emerald fabric of my suit caught the light from the crystal chandeliers overhead. I did not shrink away from the curious glances of the country club members. I held my head high, projecting an aura of absolute untouchable confidence. People naturally stepped aside to let us through. There was a dangerous gravity to the way we moved. We were not there to mingle or sip champagne. We were there on a mission of complete financial and social annihilation. As we navigated the crowded salon floor, I kept my eyes locked on the stage area. I felt no anxiety. My heartbeat remained completely steady. As an auditor, I was used to walking into rooms where people were hiding terrible secrets. I was used to the tense atmosphere that precedes a massive financial revelation. But this was deeply personal. David noticed us first. He was standing near the expensive marble bar, holding a fresh drink and laughing with a local politician. His eyes swept across the room and landed directly on me. I watched the progression of his thoughts play out across his face. First, there was a brief moment of surprise. Then a wave of absolute arrogant triumph washed over his features. He set his drink down and nudged his wife. He leaned in and whispered something into Jasmine's ear. He fully believed I had surrendered. He thought I was terrified of losing my auditing license. He thought the threat of police involvement had broken my resolve. In his mind, I was walking up to that stage to hand over a cashier check for $50,000. He stood a little taller, soaking in his imaginary victory. Jasmine turned her head to look at me. She was wearing a sparkling silver gown that probably cost more than my first car. When she saw me approaching the stage, a slow, wicked smirk spread across her face. It was the exact same smirk she wore when she opened her front door yesterday morning. It was the look of a predator who firmly believed she had cornered her prey. She patted her daughter Riley on the shoulder and stood up. She whispered something to the hired photographer and waved him away. She wanted to savor this moment without distractions. Jasmine actually took a few steps forward to meet me at the edge of the stage area. She folded her arms across her chest, focusing entirely on me, expecting to see a defeated sister-in-law. Thomas and Barbara also noticed our arrival. My mother let out a loud, dramatic sigh of relief. She turned to her wealthy friends and loudly proclaimed that her family was finally whole again. She bragged that I had come to make amends and support her brilliant daughter-in-law. My father offered me a stern but approving nod from across the room. He thought his harsh ultimatum had worked. He thought forcing me to choose between my career and my dignity had successfully pushed me back into my designated role as the obedient sacrificial lamb. They were completely blind to the reality of the situation. They saw my emerald suit and my calm demeanor and mistook it for submission. They did not understand that I had dressed for an execution. I stopped walking when I was exactly 3 feet away from Jasmine. Daniel stood silently by my side, his presence a heavy, immovable force. The string quartet continued playing their soft classical music in the background. The elite guests went back to eating their expensive caviar tarts, unaware of the bomb about to detonate in their midst. Jasmine looked at me, waiting for my apology. She held out her hand, expecting the ransom payment. Her eyes were bright with greed and malice. She was practically vibrating with the anticipation of counting the $50,000 she desperately needed. "Well," Jasmine said, her voice carrying just enough volume for the nearby guests to hear, "I am so glad you decided to be reasonable, Monica. I knew you would realize how important family peace is. I hope you brought exactly what we discussed." David walked over and stood right next to her, wrapping a supportive arm around her waist. "It takes a big person to admit when they are wrong," Monica. David chimed in, his tone dripping with condescension. "You are making the right choice for your career and for your daughter. We can put all this ugliness behind us once you settle your debt." I stared at them. I looked at the smug satisfaction radiating from every pore of their bodies. I looked at the luxurious salon they had built with stolen retirement funds. I thought about my 8-year-old daughter, sitting at home with a jagged haircut and a laceration on her ear. I thought about the $3,000 wire transfer from the wig manufacturer. I thought about the massive embezzlement and the active pre-foreclosure notice sitting on my flash drive. They were so incredibly confident in their own lies. They were standing on a mountain of fraud and abuse, demanding that I pay for the privilege of being their victim. I did not hand her a check. I did not offer a single word of apology. I simply reached into the inner pocket of my tailored emerald jacket, and my fingers wrapped around the small metallic flash drive containing the complete destruction of their entire existence. I kept my face perfectly blank, refusing to give them any indication of the devastation that was about to unfold. The silence stretched between us, thick and heavy. Jasmine shifted her weight slightly, her hands still extended, her smirk faltering just a fraction of an inch as she noticed the absolute emptiness in my eyes. She expected fear. She expected resignation. She expected me to beg for her forgiveness. She did not expect a woman who had already secured all the evidence required to send her directly to state prison. She did not expect a woman who had already secured all the evidence required to send her directly to state prison. The stretched silence was abruptly broken by the sharp tapping of a glass. The hired event coordinator was signaling that it was time for the keynote address. Jasmine blinked, her smirk faltering as she looked at my empty hands. She quickly masked her confusion with a rigid smile, whispering that we would finish this transaction after her speech. She glided toward the center of the room, her silver gown catching the light, eager to bask in the adoration of her wealthy guests. David gave me one last warning glare before following his wife, taking his place alongside my beaming parents. Jasmine stepped up to the sleek acrylic podium. The string quartet stopped playing and a hush fell over the elegant crowd. She tapped the microphone and projected a warm, melodic voice that sounded utterly foreign to anyone who knew her true nature. "Welcome, everyone," she began. "Thank you all for being here tonight. As a mother and a woman of color, I understand the profound impact that self-esteem has on our youth. This new children's hair care line is not just about products. It is about empowering children's beauty. It is about teaching our little ones to feel confident in their own skin without fear or judgment." The sheer hypocrisy of her words was nauseating. My parents nodded along in the front row, completely mesmerized by her performance. Thomas looked around, ensuring his country club friends were suitably impressed. Barbara clasped her hands together, beaming with manufactured pride. Jasmine gestured gracefully toward Riley, who was sitting miserably in her sequined dress, looking completely exhausted by her mother's relentless demands. While the entire room was captivated by Jasmine's theatrical display, I walked away from the stage area. I moved with silent, absolute purpose toward the audiovisual control booth at the back of the salon. Daniel shadowed my every movement. As we reached the small, elevated platform, the young technician working the event looked up in surprise. Daniel stepped smoothly in front of him, resting a heavy hand on his shoulder. "Why do you not take an early break?" Daniel suggested, his voice low and utterly non-negotiable. The technician swallowed hard and immediately scurried away into the crowd. I stepped up to the primary control console and pulled the metallic flash drive from my jacket pocket. I inserted it directly into the main presentation laptop and navigated to the exact master file I had compiled the night before. I dragged the file onto the active presentation software, overriding the queue of glossy promotional videos. I picked up the secondary wireless microphone resting on the console, flipped the switch, and slid the master volume slider for Jasmine's microphone completely down, cutting her off mid-sentence. Jasmine tapped her microphone, looking confused. She signaled to the back of the room, expecting the technician to fix the glitch. Instead, the massive digital projection screen behind her abruptly went pitch black. The glowing logo of her new product line disappeared. A collective murmur rippled through the affluent crowd as people tried to understand what was happening. I pressed a single button on the console. The massive screen instantly flared back to life, illuminating the entire salon with a harsh, clinical white light. A collective gasp echoed through the room. I had configured the display to show a high-resolution split screen. It was impossible for anyone in the venue to miss it. Every wealthy socialite, every local politician, and every member of my family was suddenly staring at undeniable forensic truth. On the left side of the towering screen was the official hospital evaluation report generated by Dr. Harrison. I had highlighted the most damning sections in bright fluorescent yellow, magnified so massively they could be read from the back of the room. The medical text detailed the physical examination of an 8-year-old child. It explicitly described the severe jagged removal of waist-length hair down to the scalp and the deep intentional laceration on the left ear. The medical conclusion stated that the injury required immense downward force, with heavy shears proving the minor victim had been aggressively restrained against her will. It concluded with the official mandate confirming a report of suspected child abuse had been filed with state authorities. On the right side of the split screen, I displayed the unredacted financial transaction log from Jasmine's primary business account. The date and time matched the precise afternoon of the assault. The sender was clearly identified as Crown Heritage Extensions Incorporated, an elite luxury wig manufacturer. The incoming amount was highlighted in thick red ink, showing a cleared wire transfer of exactly $3,000. The connection was brutal and absolutely indisputable. The two documents told a story of pure depravity. I raised the wireless microphone to my lips. My voice echoed through the high-end speakers, completely dominating the silent, stunned room. My sister-in-law speaks beautifully about empowering children. I announced, my tone slicing through the air like a scalpel. She speaks about building confidence, but the screen behind her tells a very different story about her business practices. Jasmine spun around to look at the massive projection. The blood instantly drained from her face, leaving her looking like a terrified ghost. She stared at the medical report detailing her assault on my daughter. She stared at the bank record proving she had sold the stolen hair for cash. Her hands began to shake violently. What you are looking at is the foundation of this new business venture. I continued, my voice ringing with cold, relentless authority. On the left is the medical report confirming that Jasmine physically assaulted her 8-year-old niece, holding her down by force to hack off her virgin blonde hair. On the right is the financial proof that she immediately sold that stolen hair to a luxury wig manufacturer to pay off the debts of this failing salon. She did not just assault a child, she engaged in commercial exploitation and child abuse for profit. The absolute silence in the salon shattered into a chaotic uproar. Gasps of genuine horror erupted from the wealthy socialites who had just been sipping champagne and praising Jasmine's entrepreneurial spirit. The delicate clinking of crystal glasses was entirely replaced by a tidal wave of revulsion. Women instinctively covered their mouths, stepping away from the stage as if Jasmine had suddenly become dangerously contagious. The local politician who had been laughing with David moments ago quickly set his drink down and vanished into the crowd, terrified of being photographed anywhere near this unfolding scandal. I kept my grip on the microphone, my voice slicing effortlessly through the rising panic in the room. Jasmine did not just have a bad day, I projected. Ensuring every single person in that venue, heard the absolute depravity of her actions. She did not make a simple mistake in judgment. She looked at my 8-year-old daughter and saw nothing but a biological commodity ready to be harvested. She lured a trusting child into a bathroom, physically pinned her arms down, and ignored her terrified cries. She drove heavy metal shears so aggressively against a child's skull that she sliced into the cartilage of her ear, leaving her bleeding and traumatized. Jasmine stood frozen on the stage, her silver gown trembling as her knees buckled slightly. She tried to speak, but the microphone had been completely deactivated. She mouthed the word lies, looking desperately at the prominent country club members in the front row. But the undeniable forensic evidence was towering 30 feet high on the projection screen right behind her. The stark clinical language of the medical report and the cold hard mathematics of the $3,000 wire transfer from the luxury wig manufacturer were impossible to dispute. She needed that specific amount of money. I continued pacing the length of the elevated control booth. She needed $3,000 in untethered liquid cash because this beautiful, luxurious salon is completely bankrupt. Every styling chair, every mirror, and every imported chandelier in this building is heavily financed and currently drowning in active liens. She has been cut off by major distributors and sued by multiple vendors for breach of contract. She took out predatory merchant cash advances at astronomical interest rates just to keep the lights on. And when the walls started closing in, she decided to fund this very launch party by butchering a child and selling her virgin blonde hair on the luxury extension market. The murmurs in the crowd escalated into loud vocal expressions of disgust. Several prominent guests immediately turned on their heels and marched toward the coat check, thoroughly repulsed by the reality of what they were attending. They realized the exquisite appetizers they were eating and the champagne they were drinking were literally paid for with the blood and hair of an abused 8-year-old girl. Down in the front row, my parents, Thomas and Barbara, looked like they had been physically struck by lightning. Barbara's hands flew to her face, her diamond necklace catching the harsh light of the projection screen. Thomas swayed on his feet, his carefully curated reality crumbling into absolute dust. They had spent their entire lives bowing to Jasmine's toxic manipulation, terrified of looking socially regressive. Now they were standing in front of their elite peers, publicly tied to a woman who had just been exposed as a violent child abuser and a commercial fraud. "Shut up, David!" roared, his voice tearing through the ambient noise of the salon. The golden boy had finally snapped. The realization that his fake prestige was being publicly annihilated shattered his arrogant facade. His face contorted into a mask of pure, unhinged rage. "Shut your mouth right now, Monica. You are making this all up. You hacked those documents." He lunged forward, pushing violently past a group of fleeing guests. He did not care about the optics anymore. He was operating on pure, blind panic and uncontrolled fury. He charged directly toward the back of the room, his eyes locked onto me with malicious intent. He was aiming for the audiovisual booth, determined to physically rip the microphone from my hands and smash the presentation laptop to pieces. He wanted to silence the truth by any means necessary. He never even made it halfway up the aisle. Daniel moved with terrifying explosive speed. My husband had spent the entire evening standing like a silent statue, absorbing the tension and waiting for the exact moment he was needed. When David charged, Daniel stepped off the elevated platform and intercepted him with the flawless precision of a guided missile. The impact was blunt and overwhelmingly decisive. Daniel did not throw a punch. He simply stepped directly into David's path and utilized his massive physical advantage to stop the charge completely cold. He grabbed David by the lapels of his expensive custom tuxedo, lifted him slightly off his feet, and slammed him backward against the heavy reinforced drywall of the salon. The dull thud of David's back hitting the wall echoed sharply. A framed promotional poster crashed to the floor, shattering the glass casing into hundreds of jagged shards. Daniel pinned David against the wall with absolute, inescapable force. He drove his forearm securely across the upper chest of his brother-in-law, locking him completely in place. David thrashed wildly, kicking his legs and trying to swing his arms, but he was entirely neutralized. Daniel held him there with terrifying ease, his physical dominance completely undisputed. Daniel leaned in, bringing his face mere inches from David's sweating, panicked features. He did not yell. He did not raise his voice. He delivered a single lethal glare that promised absolute destruction if David moved another inch. "If you take one more step toward my wife, Daniel," whispered his voice, a deep, gravelly threat that carried more menace than a screaming match ever could, "I will break every single bone in your body. Do you understand me?" David froze. The fight instantly drained out of him as he looked into Daniel's cold, unyielding eyes. He recognized that my husband was not bound by the polite rules of my parents' country club. He recognized that Daniel was fully prepared to defend his family with extreme prejudice. David swallowed hard, his chest heaving under Daniel's heavy forearm, and gave a tiny, pathetic nod of submission. From the elevated booth, I watched my husband completely neutralize the golden boy. The physical threat was handled, but the financial execution was still missing its final crowning blow. I looked back at the crowd, at Jasmine shivering on the stage, and at my parents trembling in the front row. I adjusted my grip on the microphone. The crowd thought they had seen the worst of it. They thought the child abuse and the wig manufacturer payout were the ultimate depths of this family's depravity. They had no idea that I was about to drop a financial nuke that would vaporize my parents' entire existence. The remaining guests in the salon were frozen in place, unsure whether to flee the building or stay and watch the absolute carnage unfold. My mother Barbara was the first to break the stunned silence. She scrambled forward, her diamond necklace sparkling under the harsh light of the projector screen. Her face was a mask of desperate, panicked denial. She could not process the undeniable proof of child abuse, so her mind aggressively rejected it, clinging to the only thing she actually cared about, which was her social standing. "Monica, stop this right now!" Barbara shrieked, her voice cracking as she pointed a shaking finger at me. "You are completely ruining this event. You are deliberately destroying this family over a petty misunderstanding. Jasmine just needed some immediate business capital for this launch. It is hard for a minority business owner to secure fast funding, and she made a desperate choice. You are turning a simple financial misstep into a public spectacle." Thomas flanked her, immediately trying to shield his precious daughter-in-law from the burning stares of their wealthy peers. He glared up at the control booth, his fists clenched at his sides. "You are a monster, Monica," he bellowed, completely ignoring the fact that his son was currently pinned against the drywall by my husband. "You are actively trying to destroy your brother's life and humiliate us in front of the entire community. Jasmine is family. We protect family. You take this fake medical report down, and you get out of this salon before I have you arrested for trespassing." I stared down at them from the elevated platform. They were actively defending a woman who had just been exposed as a violent child abuser simply because acknowledging the truth would make them look bad in front of their country club friends. They were labeling the physical mutilation and commercial exploitation of their own 8-year-old granddaughter as a simple financial misstep. Their moral bankruptcy was absolute. I turned off the main projection screen, leaving the room bathed in a harsh silence. I descended the steps of the audio-visual booth, my heels clicking sharply against the polished concrete floor. I did not speak as I walked down the center aisle. The crowd parted for me, parting like water. I approached the front row where Thomas and Barbara stood clutching each other in an absurd display of fake aristocratic unity. Daniel maintained his iron grip on David against the back wall, but he watched my every move, ensuring no one interfered. I stopped directly in front of the VIP table where my parents had been holding court just minutes earlier. I reached into my emerald jacket and pulled out a thick printed manila folder containing the secondary master file I had generated the night before. "You want to talk about business capital and family legacy?" I said, speaking clearly into the wireless microphone so every single person in the room could hear the execution. "You want to talk about how proudly you protect David and Jasmine because they represent the future of your wealth. I think it is time we examine exactly what that future looks like." I slammed the heavy manila folder down onto the glass surface of the VIP table. The loud smack made Barbara jump. "Inside that folder is a complete and undeniable financial audit of your personal and corporate accounts." I announced, my voice devoid of any warmth or hesitation. "You gave David administrative access to the real estate company, when you gifted him a fabricated vice president title. You trusted your golden boy to manage the wealth you spent 4 decades building. Thomas scoffed, trying to maintain his arrogant posture, but a flicker of genuine uncertainty crossed his eyes. David is a brilliant manager, Thomas spat. He has leveraged our assets perfectly to support this new venture. He certainly leveraged your assets, I agreed, nodding slowly. He leveraged them right into his wife's failing vanity project. Over the past 24 months, David and Jasmine have systematically embezzled exactly $800,000 directly out of your private retirement portfolios and corporate operating funds. They masked the massive theft under fabricated consulting fees and fake property staging invoices. The salon erupted into frantic whispers. Jasmine's hands flew to her mouth on the stage, her eyes wide with absolute terror. She knew the secret was finally out. "That is a complete lie," Barbara gasped, gripping the edge of the table. "David would never steal from us. We gave them whatever they needed." "You gave them a $2 million mansion, and they still needed more," I corrected mercilessly. "Jasmine is drowning in high-interest predatory loans and aggressive vendor lawsuits. Your son has been secretly draining every single penny you own just to keep her creditors from shutting this place down. Your retirement accounts are completely empty. Your corporate liquidity is gone. They bled you entirely dry." Thomas shook his head frantically, his face turning a sickly shade of gray. He reached for the folder, his trembling fingers fumbling with the cover. "No," he muttered, scanning the top page of the bank ledgers. "No, this cannot be right. My accountant would have warned me." "Your accountant only sees what David allows him to see," I stated coldly. "But the embezzlement is not even the worst part, Thomas. When you drain corporate operating cash and liquidate retirement portfolios, you lose the ability to service your hard assets." I took a step closer, ensuring they could look directly into my eyes as I delivered the final devastating blow. "Because of the massive, unauthorized hemorrhage David caused, your primary accounts have been overdrawn for weeks. You have missed 3 consecutive payments on your primary mortgage. I pulled the county property tax database this morning. The sprawling suburban estate you proudly brag about, the house where you demanded I get on my knees and apologize to a child abuser, was officially placed on the bank's active pre-foreclosure list at 8 o'clock this morning." The words struck them with the kinetic force of a speeding train. The wealthy socialites standing nearby gasped collectively, stepping even further away from my parents. The illusion of their massive wealth was instantly shattered, replaced by the humiliating reality of impending homelessness. Barbara let out a sharp, strangled cry. Her knees buckled completely, giving way under the crushing weight of the revelation. She physically collapsed, hitting the polished floor with a dull thud. Her designer dress pooled around her as she began to sob uncontrollably, clutching her chest as if she could not draw breath. Thomas did not even try to catch her. He stumbled backward, his hands desperately gripping the edge of the VIP table to keep from falling. His mouth hung open, a silent scream of absolute financial devastation trapped in his throat. They were defending the very people who had secretly bankrupted them, and the shockwave of that betrayal broke them completely. They had sacrificed their loyal daughter to protect a pair of greedy, manipulative predators. Now they were left with absolutely nothing. The heavy, suffocating silence that had blanketed the salon was suddenly pierced by the sharp, unmistakable wail of approaching sirens. The high-pitched sound cut through the crisp night air, growing rapidly louder until the flashing red and blue lights began violently strobing through the floor-to-ceiling front windows. The rhythmic flashing washed over the crystal chandeliers, casting harsh, frantic shadows across the faces of the terrified guests. Thomas slowly raised his head from the table, his eyes bloodshot and wide with panic. Barbara stopped sobbing for a fraction of a second, her breath hitching in her throat as she stared blankly at the revolving lights. They both looked at me with a pathetic glimmer of hope, hoping this was just a coincidence, a random police patrol passing by their affluent gathering. I did not offer them a single ounce of comfort. I simply checked my watch, verifying the exact time. The timing was absolutely flawless. Jasmine scrambled backward on the stage, her high heels catching on the hem of her silver gown. She looked like a trapped animal, desperately scanning the room for an exit that did not exist. David finally managed to peel his face away from the drywall, turning his head just enough to see the squad cars pulling into the valet zone. He let out a low, pathetic whimper under Daniel's forearm. I had not spent my entire day merely creating a dramatic slideshow for a party. I am an auditor, and auditors do not just present findings to the board. They hand the evidence directly to the regulatory authorities. Hours before Daniel and I even put on our evening attire, I had walked straight into the local district attorney's office. I did not speak to a desk clerk. I used my corporate credentials to secure an immediate meeting with the head of the Commercial Fraud Division and the lead prosecutor for the Special Victims Unit. I handed them the official medical documentation of the physical assault on my 8-year-old daughter, along with the undeniable forensic paper trail of the $3,000 wire transfer from Crown Heritage Extensions. When you provide a prosecutor with a medically verified child abuse report explicitly linked to commercial exploitation and interstate wire fraud, they do not wait around. They secure a warrant. The heavy glass doors of the luxury salon swung open with a violent crash. Half a dozen uniformed police officers stepped into the venue, their presence instantly shattering the last remaining fragments of Jasmine's glamorous illusion. The elite country club members scrambled backward, pressing themselves against the walls to clear a wide path for the authorities. The officers moved with coordinated tactical efficiency. They did not ask for the manager. They did not politely inquire about the disturbance. They walked straight down the center aisle, their eyes locked onto the stage. Jasmine let out a piercing guttural scream. She scrambled behind the sleek acrylic podium, trying to shield herself from the inevitable. The lead officer, a tall, imposing woman with a deeply stern expression, stepped onto the stage and bypassed the podium entirely. She grabbed Jasmine by the arm, pulling her roughly into the center of the platform. Jasmine Williams, the officer, announced, her voice booming with absolute legal authority. You are under arrest for the physical assault of a minor, child endangerment, and commercial exploitation of a minor for profit. You have the right to remain silent. No! Jasmine shrieked, thrashing wildly against the officer's grip. You cannot do this. I am a business owner. This is my launch party. Thomas, tell them to stop. David, help me. Her desperate cries for her usual enablers fell on deaf ears. Thomas and Barbara remained frozen near the VIP table, utterly paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of their public destruction. They could not weaponize their social status to stop the police. They could not write a check to make the handcuffs disappear. They were forced to stand there and watch as the cold, hard steel snapped shut around Jasmine's wrists with a sharp, metallic click. The sound echoed through the salon, finalizing her spectacular downfall. As the officers began reading Jasmine her rights and marching her off the stage, another pair of officers approached the back wall where Daniel still had David securely immobilized. Daniel did not resist the police. He simply stepped back, releasing his iron grip, and allowed David to slide down the drywall. David gasped for air, his expensive tuxedo crumpled and covered in white dust from the broken picture frame. David Williams, a second officer, stated, stepping forward and securing David's arms behind his back. You are being detained for questioning regarding multiple counts of grand larceny wire fraud and the embezzlement of $800,000 from a corporate entity. David did not scream or fight like his wife. He simply dissolved into a pathetic, sobbing mess. He looked over his shoulder at our parents, his face twisted in absolute terror. Dad, he cried out, his voice cracking. Dad, please call the lawyers. Tell them it was just a misunderstanding. Tell them I was going to pay it back. Thomas slowly turned his back on his golden boy. The man who had spent his entire life fiercely protecting David from the consequences of his own mediocrity finally realized there was no protection left to give. His retirement was gone, his house was gone, his reputation among the elite circles of Chicago was completely and permanently eradicated. He could not afford a lawyer to save his son because his son had stolen every single dollar required to pay the retainer. I looked around the room and my eyes found little Riley. The 8-year-old girl was standing near the coat check, shivering in her stiff sequined dress, looking completely terrified by the chaotic scene. She was an innocent casualty in her mother's relentless pursuit of vanity and greed. I gestured to one of the officers who had remained behind to secure the scene, pointing toward my niece. Child Protective Services had already been notified as part of the initial warrant request. A social worker was waiting outside in an unmarked vehicle specifically to take custody of Riley and place her in a safe, neutral environment, away from the toxicity of her parents. I watched as a gentle female officer knelt down beside the little girl, wrapping a warm jacket over her trembling shoulders and guiding her safely out the side exit. Riley would finally be free from the crushing weight of Jasmine's narcissistic demands. The salon was rapidly emptying now. The caterers were quietly packing up their silver trays, avoiding eye contact with anyone. The string quartet had long since packed their instruments and fled. The only people left in the center of the room were Thomas and Barbara. They looked incredibly small, standing among the imported Italian styling chairs and crystal chandeliers that had cost them their entire future. Barbara was sitting on the floor, staring blankly at the marble tiles, her mind completely broken by the reality of her impending homelessness. Thomas stood over her, his shoulders slumped, his face aged by 20 years in the span of 20 minutes. They had demanded $50,000 from me to maintain their perfect illusion. In return, I had handed them the absolute devastating truth. They had chosen their side, and they were now suffering the exact consequences I had promised them. Daniel gently squeezed my hand, breaking my focus on the ruins of my family. "It is time to go home," he said, his voice a low, comforting rumble. I nodded, leaning into his strength. We turned our backs on Thomas and Barbara. We did not offer a goodbye. We did not offer a final cutting remark. The absolute silence of our departure was the final nail in their coffin. We walked out the front doors of the salon, stepping into the cool, crisp autumn night. The air tasted incredibly clean, devoid of the suffocating manipulation that had choked my entire existence. The police cruisers were already pulling away, their sirens fading into the distance, carrying my abusers to their new reality. The absolute destruction of their toxic empire was complete. The story of Monica powerfully illustrates that sharing DNA does not grant anyone a free pass to inflict harm, and true protection sometimes requires severing ties with those we are conditioned to trust. For generations, society has perpetuated the myth that family is an unbreakable bond requiring endless patience and unconditional forgiveness. However, this narrative often becomes a prison for victims of emotional and physical abuse. When Monica discovered her daughter had been maliciously harmed by her aunt, her parents demanded she suppress her rightful anger to preserve their fragile social facade. This harrowing situation reveals a profound truth: toxic enablers will readily sacrifice an innocent child to quickly protect their own comfortable delusions. The lesson here is not about seeking blind revenge, but about the absolute necessity of enforcing ironclad boundaries. Monica systematically dismantling her family and their fraudulent empire demonstrates that the most effective response to narcissistic abuse is not emotional engagement, but the cold, systematic application of truth and consequence. True family is defined by mutual respect, safety, and unwavering support, not by a shared last name. We must grant ourselves the permission to walk away from abusers, even if they sit at our Thanksgiving tables. Breaking the cycle of generational toxicity requires the courage to stop accepting apologies that are never followed by changed behavior. By choosing to prioritize her child and safety over her parents' toxic approval, Monica transformed her narrative from one of silent endurance into one of empowered liberation. She proved that ending a relationship with toxic relatives is not an act of cruelty, but an act of profound self-love and maternal protection. If you found immense value in this specific reflection today, please share it with anyone who desperately needs the necessary courage to clearly set firm boundaries right now, and subscribe.